Hello, my dear friends. Thousands of women in Victorian London were addicted to opium without even knowing it. They were prescribed it, nursed, and praised for their gentleness, while their bodies were rotting away. Doctors called them too sensitive, society called them feminine, and a generation fell asleep in silence. They died not from war or disease, but from beautifully labelled bottles of pills sitting in their bedrooms. Tonight, we will enter a sweet dream where everything is gentle until it is too late. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now we dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If one were to step into the quiet bedroom of a Victorian woman, the shelves would not only hold perfume bottles, powders, and delicate brushes, but also a small glass container that gleamed with equal charm. It was filled with laudanum, a tincture of opium diluted with alcohol, packaged in bottles of clear glass with labels of soft pastel colours and lettering picked out in gold. At first sight, these bottles looked no different from the fashionable accessories that adorned a lady's dressing table. They shone in lamplight, delicate and refined, as if they were designed not for medicine but for beauty. They could sit comfortably beside a bottle of lavender water or a small tin of rouge, part of the same language of self-care. To handle them was to feel modern, clean, and even elegant. No one questioned that these bottles carried something dangerous. They were admired, and in being admired, they were trusted. The paradox was that every drop carried within it the seeds of collapse. Laudanum was strong, its grip on the nervous system silent yet deep. A woman who drank it before sleep might rest more easily, but the rest was never natural. The body dulled, the mind dimmed, and the need for more followed close behind. Still, the bottle itself seemed too pretty to be linked with harm. Families accepted its presence as naturally as they accepted soap on the washstand. That trust was built on appearances alone. It is almost absurd to imagine that something so harmful was praised simply for having a shiny label. Yet in Victorian homes, that was exactly the case. In shops across London, laudanum was displayed with the same pride as perfumes. Shopkeepers lined the bottles neatly, often alongside items that suggested refinement rather than illness. Women could purchase them without shame, their coins exchanged across counters in the same manner as if buying ribbons or needles. There was no stigma. Laudanum belonged in the category of the ordinary. This ordinariness was its disguise. Each bottle, polished and adorned, acted as both accessory and trap. The beauty of the object kept the danger hidden, and the hidden danger became a daily routine. The irony grew sharper in the way these bottles entered homes. A husband might bring one to his wife as a gesture of care, believing it would ease her sleepless nights. A mother might keep it near her bed, thinking it part of her role to endure quietly with help from medicine. No questions were asked about ingredients or risks. What mattered was that the liquid looked pure, the label elegant, the promise clear. Families treated the bottles as symbols of order in lives otherwise marked by exhaustion and constraint. If we compare this to today, it would be like keeping a sleek bottle of designer perfume on the dresser, only to discover later that every spray was laced with a lethal chemical. The shock lies not in the presence of poison, but in how beautifully it was presented. The result was a cycle of consumption that began innocently. Women sipped small amounts to relax, then returned to the bottle again when the calm faded. The doses grew. What began as occasional relief became a nightly need. Over time, these bottles dictated the rhythm of life. Meals were followed by a drop. Nights ended with a drop. Mornings began heavy and thick because of the drop taken hours earlier. Yet through all of this, the bottles still sparkled, their gold lettering still catching the light. Their appearance never changed. even as the women who used them did. I find it deeply unsettling that something so decorative was allowed to dominate lives so completely, hiding the destruction it caused behind a thin layer of charm. Inside the homes of the wealthy, bottles rested beside jewellery boxes and silver hairbrushes. In poorer quarters, they were kept in wooden cabinets, less polished but still present. The placement did not matter. Everywhere, the same image repeated glass vessels that promised refinement while delivering harm. To visitors, they did not look alarming. They blended into the landscape of domestic life. The quiet danger was accepted because it looked clean, and in a society that valued appearances, the illusion of cleanliness was enough. Medical men encouraged this acceptance. Doctors prescribed laudanum liberally, speaking of it as a balm for nerves and a solution for restlessness. The neatness of the bottles helped sustain this authority. They seemed professional, scientific, and modern. To patients, the packaging confirmed the words of the physician. If medicine looked beautiful, it must also be safe. Few doubted, and fewer resisted. The authority of science, combined with the elegance of presentation, left little room for suspicion. When women uncorked the bottles, they often did so with ritual care. A drop poured into a spoon, a sip taken before bed, a pause to let the liquid settle. These small actions, repeated daily, became part of the routine of respectability. To sleep with help from laudanum was not seen as failure, but as maintenance of the household order. The bottle's beauty turned the act into something almost graceful. It blurred the boundary between health and harm, between choice and compulsion. The consequences, though hidden at first, grew steadily. Sleep turned heavy, dreams confused, appetites faded, and strength weakened. Yet the bottles remained as lovely as before. They never revealed the truth of what they contained. Families judged by appearances, and the appearances lied. The elegance of the vessel ensured silence, and silence allowed the damage to deepen. In time, whole neighbourhoods of women relied on these bottles, their lives shaped by their contents. The same golden letters, the same pastel hues, appeared again and again, each promising relief and each delivering dependence. The uniformity of the packaging mirrored the uniformity of the suffering. It became a pattern so common that it ceased to be noticed. Only in hindsight does the full cruelty appear. The story of these bottles is not about beauty alone, but about trust misplaced. Victorian women lived in a world where appearances carried weight. If something looked respectable, it was treated as respectable. If it was presented as clean, it was assumed safe. This simple faith proved deadly. The laudanum bottle was a piece of design that carried not just decoration but destruction, and its beauty ensured that few ever questioned it. The charm of glass, the softness of colour, the shine of gold lettering, these were the weapons of a silent epidemic. They invited women closer, they assured husbands, they quieted doubts, they gave comfort in their form while stealing life through their substance. It is here that the epidemic begins, not in the first swallow but in the first glance, the first trust, the first moment when beauty replaced judgment. Soon, the use of these bottles would spread beyond private bedrooms and quiet rituals, reaching into every corner of Victorian life. Doctors in Victorian London prescribed laudanum with an ease that now feels unsettling. Women came to their offices with a range of complaints, from menstrual pain to headaches, from restless nights to feelings of melancholy, and the solution was always the same. A glass bottle of dark liquid was placed into their hands, given with the assurance that it would calm their nerves, soothe their bodies, and restore peace to their homes. There was no careful questioning, no attempt to look deeper. The medicine was offered as a universal cure, and most women accepted it without hesitation, trusting both the appearance of the bottle and the authority of the man who handed it to them. The medical belief of the time was rooted in the idea that women were fragile and needed sedation more than engagement. Physicians saw female patients as sources of disruption when they expressed discomfort, worry, or dissatisfaction. To them, the simplest path was to prescribe quiet. Laudanum, with its strong sedative effect, delivered exactly that. It is strangely comical that so many different conditions were supposedly solved by a single liquid, yet such confidence was treated as wisdom in those years. The repetition of this prescription was not confined to one class. Wealthy women left surgeries with polished bottles marked with elegant lettering, while poorer women carried rougher containers bought at apothecaries. Yet the content was the same. The liquid carried opium mixed with alcohol, powerful enough to dull both body and mind. It was convenient for doctors who wanted quick results, and it was tolerated by families who believed calmness in a household was more valuable than vitality. Over time, the bottle became less a treatment for illness and more a symbol of compliance. To refuse laudanum was almost unthinkable. A woman who questioned her doctor risked being called difficult, and that label carried weight. Husbands relied on medical authority to control what they saw as excessive nerves or moods. If a wife resisted, it could be interpreted as disobedience, a flaw in character rather than a rational choice. Many women swallowed the drop simply to avoid the judgment of being considered unstable. In modern terms, it would be like visiting a clinic today and finding that every patient, regardless of their complaint, was sent home with the same pill, and refusing it would mean being branded as unreasonable. The lack of alternatives left few options. The ritual of dosing became a daily routine, a spoonful before bed, a drop after meals, another when pain pressed too sharply. The repetition blurred the line between treatment and habit. Women found themselves relying on the medicine not just for relief, but for the acceptance it secured. Families were calmer when mothers or wives were sedated, and doctors congratulated themselves on the order they maintained. The cycle was self-reinforcing, built not on health, but on quiet. The consulting rooms where these decisions were made were often modest, filled with books and instruments that gave an impression of knowledge, yet the diagnoses were vague: nervous disorders, hysteria, sleeplessness. These words served as catch-alls that erased the individuality of suffering. The cure was always ready at hand, the same bottle waiting behind the desk. The narrowness of thought was hidden beneath the polish of medical ritual. I cannot help but feel disturbed by how many women were silenced in this way, their true needs dismissed in favour of an easy solution that left them weaker each day. Within households, drawers are filled with half-used bottles. Some women learned to measure their own doses. Others relied on servants or daughters to pour the liquid into spoons. Children grew up recognizing the sight of corked glass and the smell of alcohol mixed with opium. Husbands saw it as proof that their wives were being cared for. The presence of these bottles in daily life was normalized to the point of invisibility. They sat beside brushes and mirrors, part of the ordinary rhythm of the home. Even when side effects grew obvious, sluggishness, pale skin, heavy sleep, the connection to laudanum was rarely acknowledged. Doctors reassured families that such symptoms were natural in delicate women. More rest was advised, and more medicine was prescribed. The cycle deepened, with neither physician nor patient breaking away from the pattern. The trust in authority was too strong, and the cost of dissent too high. Occasional warnings appeared in newspapers, reports of sudden deaths or unexplained collapses, but they were easy to dismiss as isolated tragedies. Without consistent regulation or clear scientific proof, little was done to curb the trade. Doctors defended their methods, and society accepted the outcome. Women themselves had no platform to argue. Their dependence was both chemical and social, enforced by the structures of family, medicine, and culture. In this way, the epidemic advanced quietly. It was not marked by scandal or protest, but by steady, unquestioned prescription. Doctors believed they were solving problems. Families believed they were protecting order. Women carried the bottles home, their lives shaped by drops of liquid that promised peace while slowly eroding strength. The acceptance of this practice reveals how authority can blind entire communities to harm. The spread of laudanum through medical authority was the foundation of the larger crisis. Once the doctor's bottle entered the home, it became part of the furniture of life. Its presence carried the weight of legitimacy, and its use was reinforced by every figure of authority around a woman. The epidemic was not hidden. It was endorsed, repeated, and normalized. This stage of the story shows how easily a society can mistake control for care. What began as medical advice turned into widespread dependence, reinforced by trust in appearances and obedience to authority. The result was a quiet but powerful shift in daily life, where medicine became less about healing and more about silencing. In time, this silent acceptance would move beyond the doctor's office and begin to shape the private rituals of women's daily existence, altering how they ate, how they slept, and how they lived inside their own homes. The picture of a Victorian wife in her home was often described as one of composure. She prepared meals, supervised servants or tended the fire herself, managed the children, and maintained the appearance of order expected of her station. To the outside world, she looked calm, efficient, and dependable. Yet beneath that surface was a secret sustained by the small glass bottle that rested in her drawer or stood on the mantelpiece. Laudanum became the quiet companion of countless women who outwardly smiled while their bodies weakened in silence. They were praised for their patience, admired for their steadiness, but in truth, their steadiness was purchased drop by drop, night after night. The daily rhythm of a wife's life offered little space for complaint. Household duties stretched from morning into evening, and expectations left little room for rest. When exhaustion deepened into sleeplessness, or when nerves grew raw, the bottle promised relief. One sip carried her into heavy slumber. It was not rest born of recovery, but a drugged stillness that made the next day bearable. She needed it less for pain than for the dread of lying awake, mind circling with worry and duty. The promise of unconsciousness became irresistible. It is hard not to smirk at how society applauded these women for being so calm and composed when, in reality, they were drugged into silence each night. Even within families, the presence of the bottle was accepted. Husbands saw their wives performing their tasks and judged them steadily. Children saw their mothers smiling faintly at the table and learned that such quiet smiles were normal. The reality was that many of those smiles masked a numbness produced by laudanum. Every layer of emotion, anger, joy, grief was dulled until only a muted version of life remained. The mother was present in body but absent in spirit. If we compare it to today, it would be as if a modern household expected a parent to function every day while secretly depending on strong sedatives just to appear balanced, and no one around them questioned it. The strength of these women was measured not in vitality but in their ability to endure. To endure meant not to complain, not to disrupt, not to reveal the emptiness that grew inside. Doctors praised compliance, husbands valued quiet, and children inherited silence. Laudanum created a household where emotions were smothered for the sake of appearances. The women who carried the weight of this system did so with faint smiles that convinced others of their composure. I cannot help but feel sorrow at the thought of how many lives were reduced to gestures of endurance, their true voices lost under layers of sedation. Inside the home, the rituals of family life continued. Meals were cooked, clothes mended, and floors scrubbed. In wealthier homes, instructions were given to servants, accounts kept, and letters written. All the while, the wives who orchestrated these tasks relied on nightly doses to recover the strength to face another day. The cycle was hidden in plain sight. The laudanum bottle was not hidden in shame but kept close at hand, part of the background of domestic life. The effects of constant dosing became apparent in subtle ways. A wife's movements grew slower, her words softer, her laughter rarer. To those around her, these changes seemed natural. After all, women were expected to be gentle, restrained, and quiet. The symptoms of sedation were mistaken for virtues of femininity. The medicine not only controls the body but also reinforces the cultural ideal of what a woman should be. Calmness was praised, detachment mistaken for refinement, weakness rebranded as grace. The deeper tragedy lay in the private hours. At night, when duties were done, many women found themselves unable to sleep without the drug. The thought of lying awake, feeling every worry, was unbearable. So they reached for the bottle, drops slipped into spoons, swallowed in silence. The relief was immediate but false, a heavy unconsciousness that replaced natural rest. Over time, the reliance grew stronger. Sleep without laudanum became impossible. The drug was no longer optional, it was essential. This dependence reshaped their identities. What it meant to be a good wife was tied to the ability to keep going, to keep smiling, to keep the household running without disturbance. Laudanum made that possible. It was the hidden prop that allowed Victorian ideals to be maintained. Without it, many women might have collapsed under the strain. With it, they endured, though at the cost of their own vitality. Husbands rarely questioned this arrangement. For them, a wife who smiled and kept order was fulfilling her role. They preferred the softened edges of a drugged companion to the sharper presence of a woman expressing her full emotions. Society had trained them to value obedience over authenticity. Doctors reinforced the pattern by prescribing more. Thus, the smile of the Victorian wife, faint and composed, became one of the most deceptive masks of the age. Even children learned the language of silence. They grew accustomed to mothers who seemed distant, whose touches were gentle but mechanical, whose attention drifted. They accepted it as natural, never realizing that their mothers' minds were clouded by the drug. The damage carried forward, shaping families where affection was muted and words scarce. This picture of wives smiling through numbness reveals not only personal suffering, but also the larger cost of a culture built on appearances. The bottle became a tool of conformity, a way to enforce the model of the silent, dutiful wife. It was less about healing and more about control. Behind every composed figure was a story of dependency that few dared to name. In the quiet corners of parlours and kitchens, the epidemic grew. It was not marked by visible scandal, but by the slow suffocation of spirit, one spoonful at a time. The smiles remained, the duties continued, but the women themselves faded behind the mask. The story of these wives shows how deeply laudanum shaped domestic life. It blurred the line between duty and destruction, between presence and absence. It allowed families to believe in stability while hiding the cost of that belief. The epidemic thrived not because it was hidden, but because it fit so neatly into the expectations of the age. As the bottles multiplied and the smiles persisted, the epidemic settled into homes as an accepted feature of life, a quiet force that dictated not only nights, but the entire rhythm of existence. For 2 decades, a woman in Victorian London lived in a way that seemed to embody every expectation of respectability. She managed her home without complaint, never raised her voice, and kept her household in perfect order. Neighbours admired her calm, friends praised her patience, and her family believed she was the very model of a devoted wife and mother. Meals were prepared, clothes were mended, and children were guided with steady hands. To anyone looking in from outside, her life appeared untroubled. The impression of composure was so complete that few ever considered what it might conceal. Her death came quietly, recorded in the parish register as the result of a weak heart. Family and neighbours gathered, spoke softly of her virtues, and remembered the years in which she had never faltered. To them, she was a woman who had lived with discipline and ended with dignity. Yet the truth of her life was uncovered only after she was gone. When her belongings were sorted, her children discovered beneath her bed a hidden collection of more than 200 empty bottles. Each bore the faint traces of laudanum, their corks worn, their labels faded. The bottles told a story no one had suspected. The discovery shocked those closest to her. How could a woman so admired for steadiness have depended so heavily on the opium tincture? The answer lay in the structure of her life. To be praised as a model of calm was, in her world, to be expected never to complain. Every day she carried burdens without protest, and every night she turned to the bottle to silence the toll it took on her body and mind. It is almost bitterly funny to think that a woman could win such admiration simply because she was drugged enough not to cause trouble. Her children recalled her faint smiles at dinner, her steady hands guiding their lessons, her gentle voice never raised in anger. Only in hindsight did these memories shift. The calm that seemed natural was revealed to have been chemically maintained. The very qualities for which she was honoured, patience, composure, and silence, were sustained by laudanum. Without it, she might have expressed exhaustion, irritation, or even despair. With it, she became the woman society wanted her to be. The record of her death, marked simply as weak heart, reflected how little was understood or acknowledged. The physical effects of years of opium use were masked under vague medical terms. Families were spared the shame of addiction, and doctors avoided responsibility. To write weak heart was to preserve the illusion of dignity, even as the bottles told another story. If we translate this into today's terms, it would be like discovering that a relative celebrated for their discipline had lived for decades, dependent on a strong sedative, and everyone preferred to accept the official version rather than face the truth. The silence surrounding her life mirrored the silence of many others. Women were not encouraged to speak of their struggles, and when they did, they risked being judged unstable or ungrateful. For this woman, the bottles offered a way to maintain the role demanded of her. She could function through her duties, appear composed, and avoid suspicion. The cost was hidden from those around her until the evidence spilled out after her death. The collection of bottles was more than a private habit. It was a record of years lived under sedation. 200 bottles meant thousands of doses, thousands of nights of heavy sleep, thousands of mornings of dulled awareness. Each bottle represented not only consumption, but also the erosion of vitality. The weight of the glass, gathered in secret, became the measure of her life. I find it chilling to imagine her children kneeling by her bed, pulling bottle after bottle into the light, realizing that the mother they knew had never truly been awake. The story spread quietly in her neighbourhood, whispered in drawing rooms and kitchens. Some pitied her, others condemned her weakness, but most avoided speaking openly. To admit that laudanum had shaped her life was to confront a wider truth that countless other women lived the same way. Her bottles were not an exception, but part of an epidemic hidden behind closed doors. Her case illustrates how addiction could coexist with the highest social praise. To be admired as a model wife was not to be free from dependence. In fact, the very qualities admired, silence, patience, and composure, were encouraged by the drug. Society rewarded the outcome without caring about the means. The epidemic thrived because it aligned so neatly with cultural ideals. The funeral passed, the family moved on, and the official record remained unchanged. Yet the bottles, gathered and discarded, left an image that could not be erased. They stood as testimony to the hidden costs of maintaining respectability. They revealed the contradiction of a world that celebrated composure while quietly demanding it be purchased with sedation. Her story was one among many, but it carried a clear lesson. Laudanum did not only numb pain, it shaped lives to fit a pattern that society admired. It turned women into images of calm at the price of their vitality. It allowed families to avoid conflict, doctors to claim success, and neighbours to admire steadiness, while the women themselves faded beneath the surface. The epidemic was made of such lives, each hidden, each silent, each uncovered only by chance. The discovery of 200 bottles under one bed was striking, but it was only one household's truth among thousands. As more such stories emerged, the illusion of harmlessness began to crack, though slowly. People realised that behind the masks of patience and order, there was dependence repeated in countless homes. What had seemed an individual weakness was revealed as a social pattern, woven into the fabric of everyday life. The model wife, admired for 20 years, became in death the proof of a larger crisis. Her hidden bottles showed that composure could be bought, but only at great cost. The epidemic of laudanum was not about rare cases of excess, but about ordinary lives quietly consumed by dependence. In many Victorian homes, the habit of laudanum use passed quietly from mother to daughter without ever being spoken of directly. It began in small ways, when a child was asked to fetch the bottle from a drawer or to measure a few drops into a spoon. At first, it seemed like nothing more than helping a tired mother prepare for bed. By the age of 9, some girls could already handle the cork, tilt the glass with care, and pour the dark liquid into a waiting cup. These tasks became part of domestic life, as ordinary as laying out clothing or stirring sugar into tea. The presence of the bottle was never explained, and because it was always there, it felt natural. The smell of laudanum became familiar early. Its sharp, sweet odour clung to the air of bedrooms, mixed with soap, powder, and candle wax. For young daughters, this scent did not signal danger but comfort. It was tied to images of their mothers resting more easily, or at least appearing calm. Just as the smell of soap was associated with cleanliness, laudanum became associated with order and relief. The lesson was not taught with words, it was learned through the rhythm of daily life. It is darkly amusing that in such households, children could tell laudanum apart by scent as easily as they could recognise bread baking, and no one thought this was unusual. The repetition of these small rituals made the drug part of family culture. A daughter who helped her mother doze at night grew accustomed to the idea that this was what women did when tired or troubled. She absorbed the pattern without resistance. When her own life later brought sleeplessness or strain, she already knew the solution. The cycle of reliance continued, not through instruction but through imitation. What was familiar in childhood became unquestioned in adulthood. Generations repeated the same pattern. Mothers passed the habit to daughters, daughters became mothers who continued it, and granddaughters grew up in the same atmosphere. The bottles never disappeared. They moved from one shelf to another, always present, always available. The continuity was so complete that few stopped to think about its meaning. If we compare this to today, it would be like a child learning to pour glasses of wine for a parent every evening, and then growing into adulthood believing that such drinking was the natural way to end a day. The acceptance of laudanum followed this same path, invisible in its normality. The consequences of such early exposure were heavy. Many girls began to taste the liquid themselves, at first in tiny amounts, out of curiosity or imitation. Mothers sometimes offered a drop to soothe a child's nerves, or to calm them during illness, believing it harmless because they had been given it the same way. These gestures deepened the cycle, turning children into patients before they could understand. Families rarely questioned it, since laudanum was seen as medicine and medicine was trusted. The habit altered family relationships. Daughters who grew into adolescence while measuring doses for their mothers carried with them a sense of responsibility that was out of place for their age. They watched their mothers fade into drowsiness each night, sometimes after difficult days of work and silence. They learned that composure came not from conversation or support, but from the bottle. This silent lesson shaped their expectations of womanhood, binding them to the same reliance that consumed their mothers. I find it heartbreaking to picture how many young girls believed they were caring for their mothers, when in truth they were being guided into the same dependency without ever being warned. Within these homes, the cycle felt unbreakable. The bottle stood on the bedside table, refilled as often as bread or coal was purchased. Pharmacies sold laudanum freely, so supply was never interrupted. A daughter who grew up surrounded by its presence rarely imagined a household without it, even if she married and moved elsewhere. The memory of its smell and the comfort it promised followed her. When difficulty arose, she turned to what she knew, Over time, entire family lines carried this dependence. The same drug that had soothed grandmothers now quieted mothers and daughters. The repetition across generations shows how normalized the habit became. It was not hidden, yet it was never openly discussed. Silence preserved the pattern more effectively than words could. The homes themselves bore witness to the continuity. Bedside drawers filled with empty bottles, corks collected in corners, faint stains on linen from spilled drops. These marks were small but constant, reminders of how deeply the drug was woven into everyday life. The presence of laudanum was as ordinary as the presence of soap, candles, or flour. Its danger was overlooked precisely because it had become part of the fabric of existence. Doctors contributed to this inheritance by prescribing laudanum readily to women across generations. A mother who visited a physician received a bottle as naturally as her own mother had before her. The prescriptions reinforced the idea that this was normal. Families saw the approval of doctors as proof that nothing was wrong. The cycle of trust and repetition continued unchecked. The generational passing down of laudanum use reveals more than just addiction. It shows how families adapt to silence, how habits can be taught without being named, and how danger can be disguised as tradition. The most chilling part is how young children, eager to help and to care, became the guardians of a ritual that consumed their mothers and eventually themselves. This hidden legacy shaped not only the women who consumed the drug, but also the families that lived around them. Children grew up with parents who were physically present but emotionally absent. Husbands saw wives who smiled faintly but never truly engaged. Generations grew within a fog that no one named. The epidemic spread not by scandal, but by quiet inheritance. The story of daughters learning the habit from mothers underscores how deeply laudanum infiltrated private life. It was not just an individual weakness, but a family practice, passed like an heirloom. The tragedy is that the heirloom destroyed those who inherited it. As these patterns deepened, institutions outside the home also reinforced them, offering places where women could be kept under watch while their dependency was maintained in the name of rest and recovery. The institutions known as rest homes or convalescent houses in Victorian London were often described as places of care, yet for many women they became prisons of silence. Families sent wives, daughters, or mothers to these facilities when their behaviour seemed restless, their emotions too visible, or their presence in the home too troubling. On the surface, these houses promised recovery, offering quiet rooms, fresh linens, and a routine intended to soothe the mind. In reality, the treatment most often prescribed was morphine, injected each morning by nurses who followed orders without question. Women who entered hoping for peace often found themselves reduced to shadows of their former selves, dulled by the steady flow of opiates. Inside these homes, the routine was rigid. Patients rose at set hours, their movements watched, their meals rationed with exactness. The injections were part of the schedule, administered with mechanical regularity. There was no discussion of choice. Women were told it was for their health, and many submitted because they felt too weak to argue. The quiet that followed was praised as an improvement. Families were assured that their wives or daughters were calmer, more manageable, and less likely to disturb the order of domestic life. It is grimly ironic that the measure of success in these institutions was not true healing, but the degree to which women stopped speaking or resisting. The atmosphere inside was heavy. Halls were lined with closed doors, behind which women lay in beds or sat in chairs, their eyes glazed and their hands limp. Nurses passed through with trays of instruments, their work efficient but detached. Few paused to ask questions or listen. The task was to maintain silence, not to understand suffering. The very architecture of these homes reinforced the separation of patient from voice, of presence from identity. Families often visited, but the visits were brief and formal. Husbands looked upon their wives with relief at the quiet they displayed, interpreting it as recovery. Children were sometimes brought along, confused by mothers who no longer responded with warmth, but instead smiled faintly or stared without recognition. To relatives, the institution seemed to provide order. To the women inside, it was a slow transformation into lifeless figures. If we draw a modern comparison, it would be like placing someone in a care home today and considering them improved simply because they had been sedated into passivity. The medical logic behind these treatments was shaped by convenience. Doctors believed that calmness equaled health. A restless woman was sick, a silent woman was cured. Morphine offered a quick route to silence, and so it was used generously. Nurses administered it with precision, reporting compliance to their superiors. The cycle was maintained without question. Few asked what long-term effects might follow, and fewer still cared. The goal was not to restore vitality, but to preserve appearances. Over time, the women became increasingly dependent. Days blurred into nights, punctuated only by the routine of injections. Their bodies grew weaker, their minds dulled. Some drifted into states of near-constant sleep, waking only briefly before being drawn back into heaviness. The vibrancy of their lives, their roles as mothers, wives, or individuals, slipped away. They remained alive, but in a form so diminished that they resembled ghosts wandering through corridors of polite neglect. I find it unsettling to imagine how many women disappeared into these homes, remembered by families as calm and obedient, when in truth they had been drugged into absence. The settings themselves carried an eerie orderliness. Curtains drawn against bright light, halls smelling of disinfectant mixed with the faint bitterness of medicine, rows of beds with identical covers. Conversation was rare and laughter rarer still. The institution erased individuality. Each woman was treated as a case rather than a person. The repetition of the daily routine reduced them to parts of a system that valued silence above all else. In many cases, husbands preferred this arrangement. At home, a wife might question, resist, or express dissatisfaction. In the institution, she was subdued, her presence no longer disruptive. Doctors reassured families that their loved ones were receiving the best care available. The reality, however, was that these homes functioned as convenient holding places, designed to remove difficult women from view while masking their absence as a medical necessity. The tragic irony is that many women were not ill in any true sense. They may have been weary, burdened by household demands, or emotionally strained by grief and confinement. Instead of being supported, they were placed into environments where their voices were silenced further. The injection of morphine each morning served not as a cure but as a tool of control. The epidemic of laudanum in homes was mirrored here by institutional morphine use. Both relied on the same principle to sedate rather than to heal. The difference was only in scale. At home, women managed their own doses under the watch of family. In institutions, nurses carried out the task with professional precision. The outcome was the same: women reduced to compliance, their individuality dissolved beneath the influence of opiates. For society, these homes became symbols of progress, places where modern medicine addressed female disorders. For the women themselves, they were spaces of quiet erasure. The transformation into ghost-like figures was not a side effect, but the intended result. Families could rest easy, doctors could claim success, and society could maintain its order, all at the cost of the women who were made invisible. The story of these institutions reveals another layer of the epidemic. It was not limited to private bedrooms or family rituals. It extended into formal systems, supported by medical authority and social approval. The laudanum bottle on a nightstand and the morphine syringe in a nurse's hand were parts of the same structure, designed to produce silence and obedience. These houses of rest stand as reminders of how power can disguise harm as care. They show how women's suffering was managed by sedation rather than understanding, how lives were dimmed in the name of treatment. The women who lived there became testaments to the cost of silence, their presence fading until they were little more than names on registers and faint memories in family histories. As the epidemic deepened, such institutions would continue to play their role, shaping not only the lives of the women inside but also the expectations of families outside, who learned to accept sedation as the measure of peace. The dinner table in a Victorian household was meant to display order, refinement, and stability. Servants carried in dishes of steamed fish, mashed potatoes, and bread, arranging them neatly beneath the glow of oil lamps. The family gathered, dressed in clean clothes, seated according to custom. Conversation should have been the natural accompaniment to such meals, yet in many homes there was only silence. The silence was not born of politeness or discipline alone. It came from the presence of laudanum, the bottle placed discreetly within reach of the mother who presided at the head of the table. She had already taken her dose before the food was served. The effect was visible to anyone who looked closely. Her eyelids moved slowly, her gaze unfocused. Words left her lips in fragments, sentences broken before they reached their end. The pauses were filled not with laughter or chatter, but with the clinking of cutlery. The children looked at their plates, chewing in quiet compliance. Husbands often ignored the signs, content that the evening remained orderly. The drugged calm of the mother maintained the illusion of harmony. It is bleakly amusing that what passed for a well-behaved dinner was often nothing more than sedation, disguised as civility. The placement of the bottle near the table showed how normalized it had become. Just as salt or vinegar stood ready to season food, laudanum stood ready to season the mood. If tension threatened to rise, another spoonful could smooth it. No questions were asked. The drug was not seen as an intrusion but as part of the household's rhythm. It sat quietly on a sideboard or in a drawer, its presence acknowledged but never discussed. Children learned quickly to adapt to this atmosphere. They grew accustomed to mothers who did not look them in the eye, who blinked slowly, whose voices drifted away before finishing a thought. At first, they asked questions, tugged at sleeves, sought attention. Over time, they fell silent, realizing that true engagement would not come. The bond that should have been nurtured at the dinner table weakened, replaced by distance. If we compare this to today, it would be like a child speaking to a parent during dinner while the parent stared at a glowing screen, distracted and absent. Only this absence was chemical rather than technological. The effects of double doses were harsh. Some women nodded at the table, their forks held loosely until they dropped, food cooling untouched. Servants quietly cleared away the dishes, pretending not to notice. Husbands explained it away as fatigue, as a weakness of constitution. Rarely did anyone connect it to the laudanum taken before the meal. The willful blindness preserved respectability. Admitting the truth would have meant confronting a practice too widespread to challenge. The food itself lost its meaning in such settings. Meals that should have nourished became performances, their purpose more to display wealth and order than to provide comfort. The mother's absence, though physical presence remained, hollowed out the ritual. Children ate, servants cleared, and the family maintained its routines. Yet the essence of family life, the exchange of words and feelings, was missing. I find it deeply sad to picture those children watching their mother's slow blinks, waiting for recognition that never came, and learning to accept silence as the shape of home. In wealthier homes, the contrast was sharper. Fine china, silver cutlery, and servants moving with practiced precision set the stage for what appeared to be refinement. Yet the mother's drowsy state revealed another truth. The grandeur of the surroundings could not conceal the dependence hidden at the heart of the evening. Guests who visited sometimes noticed, but politeness demanded they say nothing. Silence covered the silence. The normalization of laudanum at the dinner table reinforced its role as more than medicine. It became part of social identity. A woman who appeared calm, even if sluggish, was considered composed. Her distance was mistaken for dignity, her absence for restraint. In reality, she was numbed, unable to engage with the people closest to her. The drug allowed families to claim order at the cost of intimacy. Over time, the pattern shaped generations. Children raised in such households learned that mealtime was not for laughter or exchange, but for quiet chewing and lowered eyes. They carried this expectation into their own homes, repeating the silence. In this way, the epidemic not only dulled individual lives but reshaped family culture itself. The presence of laudanum at meals also revealed the depth of dependence. Women no longer restricted its use to nights of sleeplessness or moments of pain. It was required to manage even the most ordinary rituals of the day. Eating, an act of life and connection, became another event dulled by the drug. The story of these silent meals shows how thoroughly the epidemic infiltrated daily routines. It was not confined to the privacy of bedrooms or the authority of doctors' offices. It spread into the very heart of family life, altering one of its most central rituals. The dining table, meant to gather people together, instead became a place where absence was quietly accepted. This was how the epidemic survived, not through scandal or sudden shock, but through slow repetition in ordinary settings. The bottle by the table, the slow blink of a mother, the silence of children, the unspoken acceptance of husbands. All of these kept the pattern alive. The epidemic was not only measured in bottles consumed, but in words unsaid, in glances never exchanged, in connections lost. The dinner table, once a symbol of family strength, became another stage for the quiet erosion of vitality. As laudanum shaped these meals, it prepared the way for even more tragic moments, when dependence would intrude into the most intimate acts of motherhood, carrying consequences that could not be hidden by silence. The image of a Victorian mother nursing her infant should have been one of warmth and protection. A quiet room, a chair near the hearth, the faint sound of a child suckling. Instead, for many women bound to laudanum, these moments were altered by the drug's heavy pull. A mother, exhausted from days of duty and nights of medicated sleep, would take her usual dose before settling with her child. At first, she felt calmer, her arms steady, her breathing slower, yet the same drops that dulled her nerves also stole her awareness. As the infant lay against her, she drifted not into gentle rest but into an unnatural sleep so deep that she did not stir, even when danger came. The consequence could be devastating. Some women fell asleep so heavily that their babies slipped from their laps onto the floor. The sound of a child's cry might have filled the house, but the drugged mother did not wake. In a world already filled with infant mortality, families often accepted such events as accidents. The official words were vague fatigue, weakness, misfortune. Few admitted the truth, that the mother's stupor came from laudanum. It is almost grotesque to think that society dismissed these moments as ordinary mishaps when, in reality, they were the direct result of a trusted medicine taken too freely. The silence surrounding these tragedies reveals how deeply the drug's presence was normalized. Servants might find a child lying on the floor beside a chair, lift it gently, and say nothing more. Husbands, seeing wives unresponsive, assumed exhaustion. Mothers themselves, waking hours later, rarely spoke of what happened. Shame and fear of blame kept them quiet. They rose, tended to their children as best they could, and took another dose the next night. The cycle of dependence continued, even as risks grew sharper. Rooms where these incidents occurred were often modest. A wooden cradle might stand nearby, draped with thin cloth. Chairs were placed close to beds, as women nursed at night while others slept. In these dim spaces, the line between comfort and danger blurred. The drug that promised relief from pain made even the most vital task precarious. A child's safety was compromised not by neglect, but by the slow suffocation of awareness. If we imagine this in today's context, it would be like a parent holding an infant while under the influence of strong sleeping pills. And when tragedy struck, society shrugs and calls it unavoidable. The weight of these experiences bore heavily on women. Those who awoke to find hours gone, with milk dried and cloth stained, carried guilt that words could not ease, yet they rarely shared their burden. To admit the cause was to risk condemnation, not sympathy. Families preferred silence, calling the events misfortune rather than confronting the role of laudanum. The desire to protect reputation outweighed the desire to speak the truth. Doctors did little to change the pattern. They continued to prescribe laudanum, assuring women it was safe in small amounts, even during nursing. The contradiction was plain, yet it was ignored. Infants sickened or failed to thrive, but the connection was rarely made official. In medical records, causes of death remained vague. The cycle of trust and silence ensured that little changed. I cannot help but feel haunted by the thought of how many mothers carried their infants while barely conscious, believing they were caring, when in truth the drug robbed them of that care. Within households, such accidents became whispers rather than warnings. Neighbours heard of them, clucked their tongues, and then moved on. Deaths of infants were common enough that few pressed for explanation. The acceptance of high mortality created cover for the epidemic. Laudanum's role was hidden behind the larger reality of fragile life in crowded, unsanitary cities. This disguise allowed the drug to spread unchecked, even in the most intimate corners of family life. The tragedy extended beyond individual cases. The epidemic reshaped the very idea of motherhood. A mother was expected to be gentle, calm, and self-sacrificing. Laudanum seemed to provide these qualities, smoothing emotions and quieting resistance. Yet the cost was high. The drug not only dulled women but also endangered their children. The qualities society prized were achieved by means that undermined the very foundation of family survival. Even when children survived, they grew up in households where their mother's presence was clouded. Nursing, comforting, teaching all were affected by the haze of sedation. The bond between mother and child weakened, replaced by routines carried out with dulled awareness. The emotional absence was as damaging as the physical risks. The story of mothers who lost infants in this way underscores how deeply laudanum invaded the private sphere. It was not limited to bedrooms or dinner tables. It shaped the most vulnerable act of all, the feeding and protection of children. Its influence turned natural care into peril, making ordinary love a stage for extraordinary loss. These tragedies, recorded quietly in memories but rarely in public records, reveal the silence that surrounded the epidemic. No investigations followed, no public debates arose. Families mourned privately, and the drug remained on shelves and in prescriptions. The cost was absorbed into the fabric of Victorian life, written off as fate rather than faced as a consequence. The epidemic thrived because its damage blended so easily into the accepted risks of the time. Infant mortality, maternal fatigue, and vague medical explanations all provided cover. Laudanum slipped beneath notice, even when its role was clear to those who dared to look closely. The story of one mother dozing into oblivion while her child slipped from her arms was repeated in many forms. It was not a singular tragedy, but a pattern. Each case reinforced the reality that silence and dependence walked hand in hand, sustained by a society unwilling to question its trusted remedies. As these silent losses accumulated, the epidemic's reach became undeniable, even if it was rarely acknowledged. Families carried the pain privately, while the cycle of dependence deepened. From here, the story moved further into the bodies of women themselves, where the signs of heavy use mark their very skin and bones, leaving visible traces of hidden suffering. The signs of dependence were not always hidden in Victorian homes. For women who had lived with laudanum for years, the evidence began to show on their bodies in small but telling ways. One of the clearest marks appeared on the wrists. The daily act of holding the bottle, uncorking it, and tilting it into a spoon left the skin roughened, hardened by constant contact. Over time, the repeated pressure formed calluses, a physical imprint of a habit that had taken control. These marks did not come from labour at a factory or from washing laundry. but from the quiet and steady motion of managing a drug that shaped every day. The callus on a wrist might seem insignificant, yet it spoke of years of repetition. Each morning, each evening, sometimes in the middle of the night, women reached for the same glass container. They poured with trembling hands, steadied by routine, even when weakness made the motion difficult. The bottle became an extension of the body, an object so familiar that the hand curved naturally around it. The skin toughened, but the body within grew weaker. It is almost grimly humorous to think that a mark usually earned through hard work or craft could also be earned by the endless act of lifting poison to the lips. As dependence deepened, many women struggled to hold the bottle at all. Their hands shook, fingers failed to grip, and glass slipped too easily. To solve this, some tied ribbons or cords around the neck of the bottle, fastening it to their wrists so it would not fall. The sight of such arrangements reveals the strength of need. Even as the body failed, the connection to laudanum could not be broken. The cord turned the bottle into a permanent companion, dangling from the wrist as constant as a bracelet, but carrying destruction rather than adornment. If we imagine this in modern terms, it would be like tying a coffee cup or a pill bottle to one's hand because letting go, even for a moment, felt impossible. The amount consumed in such households often exceeded what could be imagined as ordinary. Women drank more laudanum than they ate food. Meals were skipped or picked at, while the bottle remained steady in use. Stomachs grew empty, but the drug filled the system with false comfort. Children noticed the imbalance, seeing mothers take dose after dose while barely touching their plates. Husbands turned away, preferring not to count the empties that collected in drawers or cabinets. Doctors, when called, prescribed still more, reinforcing the cycle rather than interrupting it. The wrists were not the only places marked by use. Eyes grew sunken, skin turned pale, and movement slowed. But the callus at the joint was unique because it told the story of effort, of the body straining to maintain the habit even as it fell apart. It was a badge of devotion to the drug, worn invisibly to outsiders but visible to those within the home. Children who saw their mother's wrists knew the truth without words. The mark spoke louder than any admission could. I find it haunting to picture those hardened patches of skin, silent witnesses to years of quiet struggle, more honest than the smiles these women were forced to wear. In wealthier households, the signs were sometimes hidden beneath gloves. Fashion allowed for concealment, as lace or silk covered what the drug had marked. Yet the gloves themselves became complicit, disguising the story that the skin tried to tell. At dinner parties or visits, women appeared refined, their hands delicate, their posture composed. Underneath, the wrists bore evidence of nightly doses of trembling hands gripping glass. Respectability was preserved by fabric, just as silence preserved reputation. In poorer homes, concealment was harder. Sleeves rolled for work revealed the marks. Neighbours may have noticed, but few spoke openly. Addiction was not seen as a condition, but as a failing, so families chose silence to protect dignity. The absence of conversation allowed the cycle to continue, one household after another, each with its own silent witness written on the skin. The cords tied to bottles symbolized how far the epidemic had progressed. They showed that women were no longer in control of the habit, but enslaved to it. The simple act of drinking had become so central that even shaking hands and weak bodies could not stand in its way. Ingenious solutions were found, not to escape the drug, but to maintain access to it. Such adjustments revealed how dependence had seeped into every corner of life, turning ordinary objects into tools of survival in a world ruled by laudanum. The image of a mother with a bottle tied to her wrist captures the quiet desperation of the time. She moved through her house with the container always near, ready for the next measure. Children grew up with this as part of daily life, their memories shaped by the sight of glass hanging from cords. What might have seemed strange to outsiders became ordinary within the home. dependence was normalized, and its physical traces accepted as natural. The epidemic thus left marks not only on the body but also on the culture of family life. The calloused wrist was one sign among many, but it revealed the truth in plain sight, the persistence of the drug's presence, even when it scarred the skin, shows how little power women had to resist. They were judged for weakness yet denied alternatives, condemned for dependence yet offered no path away from it. These bodily signs form part of the hidden record of the epidemic. They tell us that laudanum was not just an invisible presence in bottles and drawers, but a physical force that reshaped women's bodies. The marks remained even when the bottles were empty, scars that spoke of years of repetition. As the epidemic wore on, the dependence that left calluses on wrists also entered public life, where women carried their habits into the glittering halls of society, hiding their exhaustion beneath silk gowns and polished smiles. The great houses of Victorian London often glittered with lights and echoed with music on evenings when society gathered. Invitations carried weight, and attendance at such gatherings was a sign of status and refinement. Guests arrived in carriages, greeted at the door by servants in livery, and guided into rooms filled with the scent of flowers, perfume, and polished wood. Women dressed in gowns of silk and satin, their hair arranged carefully, their jewellery reflecting the glow of chandeliers. To an observer, these evenings were celebrations of wealth and culture, yet beneath the elegance ran a quiet thread of dependence. Many of the ladies who laughed and conversed in these rooms carried within them the effects of morphine, taken in pill form before stepping out into the night. The practice was not hidden. Small tablets of opium-derived drugs circulated discreetly among friends. Some women swallowed them in carriages on the way to parties, others in powder rooms before joining the dance. The reason was simple. The pills gave them energy to smile, to engage, to seem joyful. Without them, the effort of performance felt too heavy. Life inside the home had already drained them, and social appearances demanded still more. Morphine allowed them to appear carefree, even if the feeling was hollow. It is almost ridiculous that so many glittering parties were sustained not by genuine joy, but by narcotics carefully tucked beneath layers of lace and silk. The effect was visible to those who paid attention. Women glided through rooms as though their steps were lighter than air. Their laughter came quickly, sometimes too quickly, ringing a little too loud. Conversations sparkled on the surface but lacked depth. Husbands and companions saw only the charm of the moment, rarely questioning the source of such sudden vitality. Guests praised one another for looking radiant, for carrying themselves with poise, for embodying the ideal of refined womanhood. Few considered that the brightness came from tablets swallowed quietly earlier in the evening. At dinners, between courses of rich meats and desserts, women excused themselves to take another dose. Powder rooms provided privacy, mirrors reflecting faces that already glowed with the artificial calm of morphine. The ritual became as normal as adjusting a corset or refreshing a touch of powder. Tablets were shared, offered as tokens of friendship, passed from hand to hand in gestures of intimacy. The epidemic of dependence spread not only in private homes, but in these very gatherings, where the appearance of unity and happiness masked the reality of shared need. If we compare this to today, it would be like entire groups of people at a corporate gala secretly relying on strong sedatives or stimulants just to get through the evening, while congratulating one another on their charm. The atmosphere of these events hid the emptiness within. Women who seemed to float through the evening often returned home in exhaustion, their bodies weakened by the drug's toll. The charm that society praised vanished as soon as the doors closed. Behind the facade of grace was a cycle of dependence that required more and more to sustain. What looked like vitality in the ballroom was hollow silence in the bedroom. The presence of morphine at such events shows how deeply the epidemic crossed social boundaries. It was not limited to the poor or the desperate, but was embraced by the wealthy and admired. Pills became part of the culture of fashion, another accessory carried in small boxes alongside jewellery and perfumes. The illusion of joy became a form of currency, exchanged as readily as compliments. I find it unsettling to imagine how many women lived lives of emptiness behind their radiant appearances, smiling through evenings that were fueled not by spirit but by sedation. The parties themselves amplified the problem. Music, dancing, and conversation required energy that many women no longer possessed naturally. Morphine offered a shortcut, a way to meet expectations without revealing fatigue. The habit spread quickly because it answered a social demand. To refuse was to risk seeming dull or withdrawn, a failure in a culture that valued brightness and charm. To accept was to join the collective performance, to maintain one's place in the intricate web of social standing. The epidemic thus infiltrated even the higher spaces of society. Chandeliers sparkled, fireworks burst outside, and gowns swept across polished floors. Yet within the same rooms, dependence was quietly shaping lives, leaving women unable to distinguish their true selves from the drugged versions required by society. The emptiness they carried was hidden behind jewels and silk, invisible to all but themselves.